From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
Thank you, Chris. G'day, mate. Welcome to Monday night's program. Lots to get to, including some great debate we'll have this evening. But I've got to say, if you can feel a slight twinge in your neck right now, it might be the whiplash from trying to keep up with where this federal government is when it comes to spending priorities. Now, we have spoken for a long time about Each Way Albo, who, of course, says one thing and then says another. For example, the Port of Darwin should not have Chinese control in opposition, then when in government. No, completely fine, keep it going. But then, of course, let's talk about Grim Jim, the bloke who would like to be the next Prime Minister, the first big day out generation Prime Minister. Now, last week he said that the spending focus of his government going forward, apart from the 35% of the federal budget that is welfare, the biggest percentage it has ever been, the percentage that has grown since he became the Treasurer. Last week he was briefing to the media and giving a speech that one of the major focuses was because Australia is not going to reach its 2050 net zero targets without a huge amount of government spending to get these infrastructure processes in place, that will be the focus of the upcoming budget. Now, of course, don't you love the people panicking about what we're going to be doing in 2050 in 2023? Of course, we all know that it's just about pretending that 2024 is exactly the same as 2049, so let's spend as much money as we possibly can. And as we've told you, that transition costs trillions of dollars. Now, the market is doing a pretty good job of filling that space, but Grim Jim believes that this is where the money needs to go from your taxes.
The country has made really important progress over the course of the last 18 months or so, and the government is doing its bit, investing $40 billion in this energy transformation.
So again, the centrepiece, the main focus of the next budget, which may well be the budget before they go to an election, because every first-term government, Liberal or Labor, going back as far as you can remember, they always go to an early election. So this may well be the last budget before we go to the next election, and the centrepiece is supposed to be about more green spending. But I mentioned the whiplash, because today the government is now saying that they are going to be spending less money on infrastructure. Now, there's a little game that has been played by all sides of politics for the best part of a generation, but let's focus in particularly in the past 10 years. Your local state government says, we will build, insert massive project. But what they really mean is we will pay for half of it and the federal government will pay for the other half of it. Now, the federal government never wants to be on the side of a state government that constantly turns around and says, well, it is that evil federal government that means you can't have insert big road, insert big highway project, insert big renewable energy project. So they too can go to a ribbon cutting. They agree that they will pay 50% of the infrastructure costs. Well, today, Grim Jim, who just got through saying that green spending will be increased at the next budget by billions of dollars, is now turning around and saying that they are going to cut billions of dollars of money to projects that are currently being built or being planned to be built. This is why you have whiplash.
I do think we're going to need to make some difficult decisions about the infrastructure pipeline. I do think we need to be upfront about that. And the work that Catherine is doing, engaging with the states, is to work out how we get maximum value for money, how we get the right infrastructure for our people and for their economy without putting additional upward pressure on inflation.
Now, you see, again, we were the only ones who mentioned this last week, that the IMF has said that the amount of money that particularly federal and state governments spend on infrastructure is pushing up inflation. Now, of course, the reality about infrastructure in Australia is that we need it because our population is already past where most of the infrastructure is, let alone where it's going to go into the future. And almost like these things are timed to perfection. The word comes in from overseas, you've got to cut back on infrastructure spending. And then a report lands today where the infrastructure minister says that there are hundreds of infrastructure projects around the country that may well need the chop. Why? Because an independent review of the infrastructure investment program has found $33 billion worth of budget blowouts. I would argue most of those are in Victoria. That figure is tipped to grow even further. Now, despite the fact that they have been the government for now long enough to have known what the issues are, despite the fact that in opposition there wasn't a project that they didn't back in or demand the previous government spent more money on, and despite the fact that every single state government is Labor in the country making these demands of federal governments, who do you think the current government is blaming for the infrastructure blowout? You guessed it, the last mob.
It is simply just not sustainable for the pipeline to continue in the way that it is after a decade, frankly, of being used for political purposes.
Now, that line there, for political purposes. No, what has happened here is that state and federal government go 50-50. The politics that state governments have used against the federal government is, well, we'd like to fix the M1 between Brisbane and the Gold Coast, but it's that evil federal government that's not letting us. So the federal government gets into a bind where they say, OK, we agree with the project, but we're going to have to pay for it. Now, as always, most of this stuff doesn't end up in the federal budget. It ends up off budget, with the billions of dollars for rewiring the nation, or the billions of dollars on things like the NBN, or the billions of dollars of money that is owed when it comes to things like HEX. None of that is in the actual budget. So if there are projects that are now more than $33 billion over budget, and there are dozens and dozens of projects around the country that the federal government is now openly saying they can't afford, yet because it's all Labor state governments, there will be no fighting around all of this. This is what Catherine King said about the building that's planned for your area.
What I don't want to do is promise people that we're going to build something when it clearly is not going to be built.
Well, you did in opposition, and now you're turning around and reversing it in government. Remember, now I don't know how often these things actually move votes or not, but as the shadow infrastructure minister, Catherine King was more than happy to go to the opening of an envelope promising a new school here or a new swimming pool there, or a new road here if you happen to vote Labor. And then as soon as she became the infrastructure minister, again, we mentioned it on this program, but the rest of the gallery that are just the stenographers for the politicians, not actually holding them to their own words, well, she then turned around and said, well, all of this now has to be reviewed. It has to be ticked off on by public servants. So the idiot voter who believed that the Labor politician who promised to build something but really isn't building anything is now turning around and saying that they don't know what they're going to cut. Now, interestingly, remember, it's state Labor governments everywhere. Now, in Victoria, the state Labor government, where a lot of these blowouts have happened, has been freshly re-elected. In New South Wales, they've been freshly elected. In South Australia, they're about halfway through the term. In Western Australia, remember, the opposition can fit into a mini, let alone a Tarago. So the assumption is that everything's okay, except for one state that has an election next year and an awful lot of promises to build things if you vote for them because they're 50-50 funded by the federal government. That's right, Queensland.
We're saying to the federal government, fund growth, fund Queensland, because that's good, that makes good economic sense.
But at the heart of all of this, the most annoying thing about what has happened today, where the federal government is turning around and saying we're not going to build as much infrastructure as we promised or that we know we should, is that the number of people in Australia only ever grows. This government is going to add 1.5 million people to the 25 million people who are already here. And as the intergenerational report, which set out where Australia would be between now and 2062-63, it says the Australian population will blow out to 40 million people. So there's literally millions and millions of more people that will be coming here, yet the infrastructure that already doesn't help the 25 million people, we're now going to stop paying for. It's as clear as mud what's happening here in terms of which projects are going to get the cut. But the reality here is that you have a federal government which is going to play the game that makes them look good in terms of a federal budget, but the results of that federal budget in part are because of the Ponzi scheme of extra population and greater demand for things like aged care means that they're not going to be spending money on the infrastructure that will take a population of 40 million people. And remember, their own intergenerational report tells us that even though our population is going to virtually double in the next few years to 40 and a bit million people, the expectation is that despite the fact that there's more workers and more workers paying tax, the federal government will have budget deficits every year for the next 40 years. Every year for the next 40 years. The red line is the current budget, which we know is $20 billion in surplus. The rest of it, down the drain. So they're going to have more money than ever before because there's more people working, but they're also going to be spending more money than they currently have and will have 40 years into the future. And rather than turning around and cutting the 35% of the federal budget that is welfare, they're going to cut the projects that every state, every city needs. That's why you have whiplash. And that's just me explaining it, let alone my neck trying to work it all out today. Now, of course, this time tomorrow, the Albo dozen of 11 interest rate rises may well end up becoming 12. 12 on their own. Since Anthony Albanese became the Prime Minister, there have been 11 interest rate rises. These have created huge financial problems for the people who were moving from off fixed to variable rates, and those that were already on the variable rates, well, the python has been squeezing for some time. As we told you last night, if there is a change of just, again, the 0.25 like there normally is, well, 55% of Australian households will end up in a financial situation where they are literally spending too much on paying off their house, which means they don't have enough money to pay for the basics of life. And the expectation is that there will be that interest rate rise which will take place tomorrow because inflation, as we've been talking about here, has been increasing for the past 2 months. Now, while the headline figure is, 5 and a bit percent, on petrol, it's 20%. On insurance, it's about 20%. On electricity, it's about 20%. And the expectations are that if the Reserve Bank doesn't make the decision tomorrow, they're doing it to curry favour with the federal government, who, remember, sacked the last Reserve Bank governor because they say he was the one who was raising rates too high, as opposed to the current Reserve Bank governor, who was Philip Lowe's deputy, who agreed. When the government spends too much, when inflation is too high, the only thing and the only option they have is to raise interest rates. Hence why the Financial Review says that the Reserve Bank's credibility is at stake, and their independence as well about whether they make the decision to jump this month or next month. But I want you to remember something very clearly. This was the reaction of Jim Chalmers when he was the Shadow Treasurer, when the first of these interest rate rises happened in the month of the last federal election. The sky was falling in.
This is a full-blown cost of living crisis on Scott Morrison's watch. When things are going well in the economy, he takes all of the credit. And when times are tough in the economy, he takes none of the responsibility.
And the reaction of Jim Chalmers when 11 more rate rises happened on his watch, who was to blame for that? Well, that's right, no one.
We know that people are doing it tough. People who are doing it tough. People who are doing it tough. People are still doing it tough. People are doing it tough. People who are doing it tough.
The sad news is that if there is an interest rate rise tomorrow, or maybe it is put off for another 30 days, the likelihood is that the rates will stay at this level or even a little bit higher for at least the next year. If that's the case, then this becomes a live election issue going into the next federal election. And Albo and Chalmers can say cost of living as many times as they want.
Cost of living.
Cost of living.
Cost of living. Cost of living. Cost of living.
Cost of living.
Cost of living. Cost of living.
The reality of the country that they are overseeing right now is in the report that we brought you last week about Food Bank with 3.7 million Australian households who don't have food. Today, there was a line for food in Sydney. Last week, there was a line for food in Brisbane. And again today, there was a line for free food in Melbourne. That's the reality of life under Albo and Chalmers, no matter how hard they try to spin. There are billions of dollars that Australians lose via scams, and there are millions of people whose data has ended up on the internet because of hacking. Now, we know this, of course, is the mass release of customers' data through things like the Optus hack or the Medibank hack or even the private information of our politicians when Parliament House was hacked. And a website which runs a lot of news on the behalf of the permanent bureaucracy, the Mandarin, says that half of all of Australians have been hit by data breach spills. That's according to the Privacy Commissioner, and they say that 3/4 of Australians whose data have been breached say they've experienced harm as a result. Well, I've got some sad news for you, because the one place where everything from your medical records, your superannuation and your tax information has been hacked, MyGov. The information source which makes it easy to apply for a passport, easy to be able to file your tax returns and easy to keep a record of your vaccinations has now apparently been compromised. According to Channel 9, the federal government have warned today that Centrelink, Medicare and the tax office accounts were the targets to phishing attack scams from those who are using a scam in a box kit. The technology can create fake websites and provide the know-how for scammers to launch a cyber attack. The relevant minister, Bill Shorten here, says that already $3.1 billion has been lost after people have breached MyGov. Now, important to note in all of this is that there are many different types of hacks. There are the types of hacks where literally they try to bust into the system. There are other hacks where they will send you emails, and because you half read them, they look like they come from the organisation, so you click on the link. Or you get a text message from an organisation that you do business with, so you touch the link and therefore you end up filling out all of your details. The reality is that it isn't actually the organisation that you do business with, or in this case MyGov. Instead, it's a fake thing put out by scammers to get your information. So put simply, here's what you have to do. You have to make sure that you basically don't trust much that you get on the internet. Your bank will not email you a form to fill out. The tax office will not email you a form to fill out. If you get a text message from someone from Australia Post saying, press this button, put in all of your information to find out a parcel delivery, well, that's not true either. And if all of this is too hard to follow at any one time, if you doubt the information that is being requested of you, ring the company or ring the organisation directly through the telephone number you can find online, or dare I say, in the phone book, to make sure that you are dealing with them. But MyGov is some very sensitive information, and this is now starting to be compromised. Now, of course, we know that on an international level that there is one country that is deeply responsible for much of the hacking that takes place. It's the one that the Prime Minister is currently in. In this program, he will make some comments after his one-hour meeting with Xi Jinping, and it's China. In fact, the Five Eyes countries and most of their federal police forces have openly said that China is the source of many data hacks around the world. Don't forget that the data hacks that have happened here in Australia include defence targets. And don't forget that there was Chinese spying on the nuclear reactor at Lucas Heights, universities in every state in the country, and the people responsible for the data hack on Parliament House, China. Geez, I wonder whether that was mentioned at all in the backslapping session that has just broken up in Beijing between our Prime Minister and China's leader. What's the bet that this never got mentioned at all? I repeat, we expect to hear from Anthony Albanese in the next couple of minutes, so I'll wrap up my thoughts here because I want to get plenty of debate on the television. Let's take a quick break and we'll get back to you in a moment or two's time with the comments of the Prime Minister from China, but plenty of debate about the Prime Minister in China next. You're watching Paul Murray Live on a Monday night. Thanks for doing so. Standing by for the Prime Minister, he will make some comments from China, but lots of things to say about that trip and a whole lot more with Ladies' Night on Monday night. It is none other than Carolyn Marcus, our senior reporter here. You're doing the dancing, I can't, I'll look awkward. Of course, here at Sky News, the wonderful Linda Scott, on National Cabinet with local government, but from the City of Sydney Council as well. And lovely Senator Jane Hume, who's doing her bit in the Senate today, watching Greens storm out and all the rest of it. Geez, I reckon there might have been a part of you that went, OK, we've got the majority now. Who can we censure? What can we do? What will we do? We've got 10 minutes here. Let's use the numbers. So, Jane, of course, you're going around the country talking about cost of living, doing the the hard work about showing some really tough stories. And I remember there was one story in particular that has always knocked me for six. While I was talking before about today, people queuing for food in Sydney, Melbourne and also in Queensland, that there was a person in Perth, and the person in Perth gave evidence to your committee that they wanted the ice, because the ice could keep what little food they had in their car cold, but then it would also start to melt down and then be a source of water for the family that was living in the damn car. Now, we heard last week about the Prime Minister saying, the number one focus of this government is cost of living. But the reality is that there's an awful lot they could be doing that they're not. Again, you've been doing this around the country. And I like that, I've got a couple of emails from lefties saying that it's just a right-wing talking point, but the reality is that there are queues around the block for free food in 21st century Australia.
That's right, and not only that, but, take us back to the beginning of the year when Anthony Albanese said that his New Year's resolution was to bring down the cost of living. Well, we're now at, November? It's kind of getting close to the end of the year, and the cost of living is just getting worse. Of course, the big concern for Australians is that tomorrow the Reserve Bank will have to respond to that increasing inflationary pressure that just doesn't seem to be alleviated. And there's a reason why for that, and that's because the Labor government doesn't have a plan to tackle inflation. It talks about the cost of living in terms of subsidies, what it's done to subsidise childcare, what it's doing to subsidise your electricity bill, what it's doing to subsidise. That's all taxpayer money that's being spent. Of course, that can actually make the inflationary problem worse. We want to see the government have a plan to tackle inflation, its causes, not just its symptoms. Otherwise, inflation is going to stay higher for longer, which means interest rates are going to stay higher for longer. And already, the RBA is saying that they're not expecting inflation to come back to their target band of 2 to 3% until the end of 2025. Now, that's 2 more years of pain for ordinary Australians, and we're seeing it every day with the price of food going up by around 8%, by the price of electricity going up by 18%, gas by 28%, housing by more than 10%. It's becoming overwhelming for so many households. And not only that, but the ABS are telling us that while inflation is going up, certainly, that cost of living is disproportionately affecting working families, those families that have a mortgage, because the average mortgage, let's say it's around $750,000, costs are now an additional $22,000 a year. That's not the sort of money you find down the back of the couch. And it's only going to get worse tomorrow if rates rise again.
Well, and again, the analysis is that if it goes up by another 0.25%, it'll be 55% of Australian households that will be financially struggling to be able to pay off their houses. Put simply, the percentage of how much you have after you get paid, things start to get worse. There's one thing that I do not understand this federal government is not doing, and certainly it's petrol. I'll bring that point up in a second. But, Linda, when they've got a surplus of $20 billion, why haven't they taken $2 billion and said to the charity sector, we've got extra money, this is not inflationary, but here's $2 billion immediately to the charity sector to be able to deal with the people whose metaphorical life is on fire?
Well, look, there's merit to the idea if only there wasn't so much government debt and rising interests from the last government, that, the government has really difficult choices about whether to pay down that very high government debt, record government debt, and get rid of some of that interest in order to maximise taxpayer money that they can use for the public good, or to do this kind of cost of living relief and, of course, supporting those great charities. In the City of Sydney, we've also done food relief. We started doing that for the first time during COVID, and it is something that we have had to continue. There is no doubt when you look not just in Sydney, right around the country, that people are struggling with cost of living pressures. Of course, one of the best answers to this, and something I know Senator Hume is very opposed to, sadly, is wage rises for normal working people. What we need is to make sure
that's her
that in the
position,
face of those increases, people can afford, when they're working, to ensure that they can pay for these increasing cost of groceries, increasing cost of petrol and other cost of living increases. And so it's why, the Closing the Loopholes Bill, all those really important industrial reforms that will allow people to get paid more fairly, that is going to make a really significant difference. It's disappointing to see the coalition opposing these kinds of measures that will improve the lives and improve the buying power of normal working Australians.
Jane, I'll let you respond in 1 second. Caroline.
That is the most economically illiterate argument I have ever heard.
All right, well, you formulate one as a response in a moment, but Caroline, because I want to get you in because I've got a feeling these two might be able to follow that rabbit hole for a few minutes here, and I want to make sure we get plenty of debate in before we have to get to the Prime Minister. Again, this issue is one that much of the political media doesn't want to talk about it because it is so relentless, right? It is sort of the same thing all day, every day. But the reality is that there's a new section of people that feel the squeeze every single day, and the Prime Minister can't get out of his fundamental promise as to the reason to make him Prime Minister, which, as we've shown multiple times, that poster, a Labor government will lower the cost of living.
Yeah, and I mean, the fact is it hasn't, and those images just speak 1,000 words, don't they? It is actually heartbreaking to see those lines outside food banks, and to try and politicise it in the sense of this is just a right-wing issue. How is it a right-wing issue? This is a human
Because apparently
issue.
criticism of the government is, borderline misinformation, sense of the internet.
Exactly, and why I fear it doesn't fit into certain media outlets' narratives, and why it doesn't dominate the news cycle in the way that things like the Voice referendum haven't. I mean, imagine, radical idea, we spent that $500 million on a referendum that would never get up to actually helping people feed their families.
Give it to food bank. All right, Jane, I'm giving you a minute, and only a minute. The Senate bells will ring to respond to Linda, and then I'm going to move it on.
We all want to see wage rises, Linda. Of course we do. But they have to be real wage rises. They can't be nominal wage rises. Otherwise, you're just making the inflation problem worse. The only way you're going to have real wage rises is by increasing productivity. That means no industrial relation reforms like the same pay, same job, same pay bill, closing the loopholes bill. And it also means tackling inflation and bringing inflation down.
How disappointing.
High, your real wages will be negative.
Wage rises and you're saying no right here on Sky News. How sad.
All right, everyone gets the last word on that. All right, now let's talk again. We'll get to the Prime Minister in China in a second because we'll react to the comments that he has to make. You should know, by the way, of course, 1 hour meeting, all right? So you've got to assume there's translators on both sides, so that's 30 minutes gone. And then that would have been basically they spoke for 15 minutes each. Fascinating. The world has been changed forever. Mm-hmm. We'll get to that in a second. But let's talk here about the Greens and the nonsense that they carried on within the Senate today, walking out after saying the same things that have been said in protests for some time. At what point do you think it becomes unpalatable for the Labor Party to preference the Greens above the Liberal Party in elections?
Well, I think that point probably happened about a week or two after the October 7 massacre, when it became clear that the Greens are not interested in human rights, or at least the rights of the victims of terrorism when they aren't their people, or it doesn't fit their narrative. I mean, I have to call out the hypocrisy of the Greens here, and I know I'm wearing their colour, so please don't take that as an endorsement tonight, because it's
you're taking the colour back.
Opposite.
You're claiming you're taking it back. There you go.
Co-opting the colour.
There you go.
Let's take it back. It's too good a colour for them. These people are hypocrites. Where were they when Muslims were killing other Muslims in Yemen, in Syria, in the Saudi Arabians, in Libya? They're silent on those issues. It's only when Jews are involved, and I'm not afraid to call out some of their conduct in the past couple of weeks as blatantly anti-Semitic. The post that Greens leader Adam Bant did recently, where Israel was not even on the map anymore, it was Free Palestine, it was the entire state of Israel painted in red for Palestinian colours. That is shocking anti-Semitism. And today we see this. I mean, why don't they call, if they're interested in peace, if they're really interested in peace, call for an immediate surrender of Hamas, call for the immediate return of hostages, and this will end tomorrow. Hamas is solely responsible for thousands and thousands of their civilians dying.
So, Jane, again, the answer is because most of the media vote for them, but how is it not politically toxic for the Labor Party to be in a vote-dependent relationship with people who say the things they have and done the things they have since October the 7th?
Yep, that's a really good question, and one that we scratched our heads over today. And finally, Linda, something you and I can agree upon. The behaviour of the Greens today, you'd want to say it was undergraduate, but quite frankly, there's no, beer pong and stealing a mascot after this is all over. This was disgraceful behaviour, and you could see my Labor colleagues in the Senate squirming in their seats because they have been put in a very difficult position. The coalition is clear. We stand with Israel. The attack on October the 7th was unforgivable, and Israel have a right to defend themselves. But you can see some of my colleagues on the other side of the chamber wavering. I think had their chance, a few of them would have worked out alongside the Greens.
Yeah, we've got a 2-minute warning from Andrew Clennell, who's standing by for the press conference with the Prime Minister after the meeting with the Chinese President. So that's your warning on time, Linda.
Look, it should not be the case that legislators walk out to protest. I really am so disappointed to see the Greens' actions today when you have the absolute privilege of being elected in any parliament. You should use that opportunity and take the voice up of the people that voted for you, indeed, hopefully for all of Australia, and make the case in the House that you're elected to. Walking out, simply protesting, is just absolutely a devastating thing to do because it takes away the voice of the people that voted for you, takes away that important legislative proposition. So I was really disappointed to see what the Greens did today. Whatever side of the argument you're on, I think it's wrong to just be a party of protest, not a party of progress. It's why so many people are becoming increasingly disillusioned with the Greens. They've stopped talking about the environment. They've stopped talking about those really core issues that people like Bob Brown used to actually stand for, reasons why the party was created in the first place. And they've moved on to just being radical protesters, not able to actually legislate and work to achieve outcomes for the people that are voting for them.
What about
I should just say, of course, sorry, I've got to speak to the live pictures here, obviously the bottom left of your screen. Interestingly here, we saw the pictures a couple of hours ago of when the Chinese President and the Australian Prime Minister were meeting. It was all quite the great halls and all the rest of it here. One assumes this is the embassy, but if somebody can work out where the back channel on all of this is, but apparently it's only going to be comments from the Prime Minister alone from that lectern. Whether there is any joint press conference or something that happens tomorrow, we'll find out, and we'll obviously ask Andrew Clennell in the background. Sorry, obviously we wait for the live picture, but as you were saying...
Well, look, I think it's all very well to comment on the points of the protest, but what about their actual position that they've taken in the past few weeks since that massacre? Can Labor continue to go on preferencing a group like that? I think that's Paul's central point, which was nicely deflected that, Linda, but can your party continue to support a party like
At what point does their failure to condemn Hamas become a problem?
Well, look, of course, every party puts forward their own propositions. I mean, I'd be quite terrified if I was on the other side of the parliament to take some of the preferences that they do from some of those really fringe right-wing groups. Nobody is equating the fringe views of some of those right-wing groups with the Liberal or the National Party.
These are terrorist sympathisers.
Sure, but my issue here, and this is what I'm saying about the conversation, that because most of the people who talk about politics vote for the Greens, that they don't, and obviously Labor with just a third of the vote, the only way they get to a majority is largely through Greens' preferences, is that at some point, I believe there has to be a conversation between Labor and Liberal about, while it might be mathematically disadvantaging them, they actually at some point have to say that when given a choice of being in power or making sure that somebody is in power who doesn't share the views of the extreme positions, that at some point they have to choose their political enemy over the distasteful people who help you maintain power.
Well, especially if you're supposed to be the party of integrity, and that's what you have campaigned on.
All right, before we get to the Prime Minister here, Jane, and again, if I have to cut you off, I apologise, but the expectations that we have here is that we're going to see a series of trade barriers start to be removed, but there's a whole bunch of national security stuff that I'm pretty sure didn't get mentioned in the 15 minutes when they were actually talking and not hearing the other one and not listening to an interpreter. What do you think the expectations should be on what we're about to hear of a successful meeting in Beijing?
Well, we would hope to see a normalisation of the trade relationship that we had with China some years ago before they started imposing economic coercive methods onto Australia, because Australia stood up for what was in its national interest. It would simply be a normalisation of those relations by removing the tariffs that were placed on wine, on lobster, crayfish, everything else. And the reason why they were imposed, I mean, that is in fact a breach of the free trade agreement that we had with China that was set up by the coalition government some years ago now. And it would have been seen as a breach by the World Trade Organization had it have gone to them. So we would hope to see that those sanctions are removed and a normalisation of relationship. That would be a good thing. But at what cost? We want to make sure that that Anthony Albanese hasn't been held over a barrel, that he hasn't sold the farm, that he hasn't compromised our national interest in a way that would be a detriment to Australia.
Yeah, again, Linda, my suggestion here is that there's obviously not going to be the acquiescence to China, but I think that that's the point, which is that if we just move to mute, then China's happy, because even when we try to turn around and say, hey, can we work out this thing which has clearly got out of control in your country that's destroyed the world economy and killed millions of people, they of course turn around and put Australia, metaphorically, the head on the spike as a way of sending a message to Canada, New Zealand, England, if you displease us, look what we can do to you here.
Look, I think the Prime Minister is very skillfully playing a middle power position here. He's gone to the US and now, really a week later, he's gone to China. It's very important as a very strategic international middle power that Australia plays a very significant role, and I think he's showing real leadership here. This is a historic visit. Obviously, it's the first time in 7 years that an Australian Prime Minister has been to China, but as Jane has outlined, all of these barriers were put in place that has caused significant economic problems for Australia, and it is important that we work constructively where we can, where we have agreement with China, and of course that is not everywhere. Where we have agreement, we can try and remove some of those trade barriers. That's not only important economically, it's really important for global peace. It's very important that we have cultural exchanges. I know, for example, that the Australian Ballet is thinking about touring to China next year. These are really important global arrangements to share culture, to share trade, to remove trade barriers that are good for our economy and they're good for our nation. And they are really a great example of the Prime Minister showing great global leadership at a very, very difficult time.
Now, as I've said before, way too often the reporters end up being as well trained as Toto to not ask any domestic questions, and even if they do ask a domestic question, it quickly becomes a foreign question, which meant today, largely on your 6 p.m. news, you got Albo the tourist.
At the Temple of Heaven's famed Echo Wall, unmistakable echoes of the past.
Have we been studying the Gough Whitlam pictures?
Gough Whitlam captured in a historic photo here 50 years ago.
Look, it's symbolic for many reasons. First, the Temple of Heaven was where Gough Whitlam came 50 years ago.
50 years after Gough Whitlam first forged ties with China, the Prime Minister spent the day retracing his steps.
Caroline, I don't care. I truly don't care. And the way that this was made as this great central moment of history that, OK, I understand about the normalisation 50 years ago, but to retrace the steps of 50 years... This was the story today. Not about, the fact that, as I said before, China hacked the ASIO blueprints, they hacked the Australian Parliament, and they've hacked multiple universities.
Yeah, and they still have Confucius Institutes
Correct.
that operate, and they get into reports I did earlier this year, they even get into our language schools and influence how both the Chinese-speaking students here and non-Chinese students here learn about the Chinese government and pledge allegiance to the Chinese government. I mean, it's really concerning stuff. I get that you have to keep your friends close and your enemies closer, but, it does reek of a sort of appeasement. It
feels to me Australia doesn't get anything out of it. The bully just stops punching you.
Exactly.
Is that the win?
It's like the runt of the schoolyard saying, just please stop punching me, you can take my lunch.